Okay, so what if? What if the biggest threat, the next really big global challenge, isn't, the usual suspects, not ideologies clashing, but something much more basic, like actual stuff we need to live just running out.
Yeah, like water, clean air, the essentials.
Exactly. Picture it,
Yep.
The ground cracking dry, or this scramble for the minerals that power all our tech. That's the territory we're really digging into today, based on the sources you sent over.
It's a huge challenge, and it really does touch almost everything. And you feel the urgency ramping up, don't you?
Probably.
We see these little signals everywhere. Local shortages, bigger tensions between countries.
Yeah.
It's all reflected in the material we're looking at.
Absolutely. And yeah, history's full of fights over resources, land, gold, sure, but even salt roots or spices, right?
True.
But the sources we've got here, they paint a different picture for now. It feels like this mix of climate change, sheer population numbers, and our hunger for resources. It just makes it uniquely urgent. The stakes feel higher.
That's a really key point. One of the sources uses this term I found interesting, threat multiplier.
Ah, right, for climate change.
Exactly. It doesn't just invent these resource problems, but it pours gasoline on the fire, basically. It makes existing shortages and stresses way worse.
Okay.
And then you layer on, billions more people needing food and water, plus the materials for all our modern gadgets and green tech. It gets incredibly complex and potentially pretty unstable.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack this whole global resource challenge using the insights from the material you provided. Let's start with the basics. What are the big ones? The fundamental resources really feeling the squeeze right now.
Well, water. Has to be water at the top of the list. The numbers in your sources are pretty sobering, frankly.
Oh, sobering.
Over 2 billion people right now living in places with high water stress.
Wow. 2 billion.
Yeah, that's 1 in 4 people on Earth? And the projections, they suggest by 2025, which is, practically tomorrow, we could be looking at half the world's population facing water scarcity.
Half the world. That's just staggering. And the sources give some really clear examples of where this is already causing friction, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Like the Nile, the whole situation with Ethiopia building that huge dam, the Grand Renaissance Dam. It's not just an engineering project, is it? For Egypt and Sudan downstream, it feels existential. Their water supply depends on that river.
Absolutely existential. It's a perfect example of how water infrastructure becomes a massive geopolitical issue, a real potential flashpoint.
Yeah.
And you see similar things happening with the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Oh, yeah. Turkey, Syria, Iraq.
Exactly. Those rivers, historically the lifeblood of the region, they're shrinking. And that's creating serious tension over who gets how much of the water that's left. It's not just environmental, it's deep-seated political and security stuff.
And then, beyond water, food security, another massive piece of this. The sources connect this to land turning into desert, desertification, and just the basic strain of trying to feed everyone as the population keeps climbing. Less good land, more mouths to feed. It's a tough equation.
It really is. When fertile land degrades, you just can't grow as much food. It's simple maths, really.
Yeah, right.
And that hits food availability, prices. Yeah. And with the global population still rising, those pressures just build and build.
Okay, and then there's the minerals thing. This feels very 21st century somehow. This intense competition for rare earth elements.
Yeah.
The stuff we need for electric cars, high-tech weapons. One source even called it a new Cold War, a fight for the building blocks of future tech.
It is. And what's interesting, it's not just about the high-tech, super rare stuff either.
Oh.
One of the sources brought up sand. Just
sand, like on the beach.
Well, yeah, the kind used in construction. The demand is so huge in some places that even sand is becoming a source of conflict and illegal trade. It shows how even things we think are abundant can become critical when demand goes wild.
Huh. That's surprising. Sand. And we shouldn't forget, one source mentioned it right at the start, clean air.
Crucial.
We breathe it every second, obviously, but in so many places it's getting seriously degraded, maybe the most fundamental resource there is.
And it links back, doesn't it? The things that pollute the air often mess up the water and soil, too. These problems aren't really separate boxes.
Right, interconnected. You mentioned climate change as that threat multiplier earlier. The sources really seem to hammer this point home. How exactly does climate change crank up the danger level on these shortages?
Well, it acts like an accelerant. Think about rainfall patterns changing. More intense droughts in some places, worse floods in others.
Okay.
This directly hits water supplies that might already be stressed. and it can devastate farming. One really stark example highlighted in the sources is the Syrian civil war.
Ah, yes. I saw that mentioned.
There's a strong argument that a historic, prolonged drought, likely worsened by climate change, was a major factor. It drove people off the land, into cities, increased social tensions, and contributed to the unrest that eventually exploded into conflict.
Wow. So a drought isn't just a drought. It can be a trigger for much bigger things.
Exactly. And the sources point elsewhere, too. South Sudan, for instance.
Right.
Existing conflicts over land and water there have been made much worse, much more prolonged by changing environmental conditions. Climate change becomes this extra layer of stress that can push fragile situations over the edge. And then you've got new areas opening up, like the Arctic.
Because the ice is melting.
Precisely. Receding ice potentially uncovers oil, gas, shipping routes. And suddenly you have Russia, the US, China, all jostling for position and resources in this newly accessible frontier. It's creating a whole new arena for geopolitical competition.
So the fallout from all this scarcity goes way beyond just fighting over a well or a mine. It's reshaping how people live, where they live. The sources talk a lot about migration.
Yeah, that's a huge consequence.
Yeah.
The figures are pretty striking. Over 110 million people forcibly displaced in 2022 alone.
110 million.
And while conflict is a big driver, a growing chunk of that is linked to climate disasters, to environments just breaking down and becoming unlivable. When people can't get basic resources where they are, they move. Often, they have no choice.
And looking ahead, the sources paint a picture of potentially whole communities having to relocate, rising sea levels, farming zones shifting. The scale of future displacement is almost hard to wrap your head around.
It is. We could be looking at climate-driven migration becoming one of the defining challenges of this century. Huge humanitarian crises, massive pressure on borders, potential instability. It's a really serious prospect.
And it's not just about these huge dramatic shifts. It's already messing with economies in maybe subtler ways, too. The sources mentioned the toilet paper panic during COVID.
Yeah, that was weirdly revealing, wasn't it?
It was. A sudden perception of scarcity, even if temporary, caused this massive behavioral shift.
Exactly. And maybe a more direct example we all feel is, gas prices.
Oh, yeah.
Fluctuations in energy costs, supply chain hiccups. These often trace back to the security and availability of resources somewhere down the line. Our economies are pretty fragile to these disruptions.
And finally, it seems like these resource pressures are actually changing who's friends with whom on the world stage, shifting political alliances.
Definitely. Countries that share vital resources, like a river basin, or countries that depend heavily on others for energy or minerals, they're forging new partnerships, and sometimes finding themselves at odds with old allies. Who controls access to key resources is becoming absolutely central to international relations and, frankly, to global power.
So it all seems to funnel back to this really fundamental question that popped up in the sources. Are we, as humans, just going to keep fighting over shrinking piles of stuff? Or can we figure out a way to innovate, cooperate, manage things better? The stakes feel incredibly high.
They really are. The sources are pretty clear on this. The decisions we make right now about how we manage water, energy, food, they're going to shape our collective future. It's crunch time.
Right. Do we go down the path of, every nation for itself, which sounds like a recipe for more conflict?
A zero-sum game, basically. Or do we try to find collaborative, sustainable ways forward that could actually benefit everyone in the long run?
And those warnings in the sources, they really hit home. No army can defeat thirst.
No economy can outlast famine.
No border can stop desperate populations. These aren't just slogans. They feel like fundamental truths we ignore at our peril.
That's the heart of it. You can't solve thirst with tanks or build a wall high enough to keep out the consequences of ecological collapse forever. These challenges demand a global view and a real commitment to shared solutions.
Yeah.
Like one source put it pretty powerfully, I thought, the clock is ticking and the world is watching how we respond.
So wrapping up this deep dive, the big takeaway from all this material seems to be that this growing scarcity of just essential stuff, it's a massive, complicated threat, way bigger than just traditional wars or politics.
Precisely. It's all tangled together. Water, food, minerals, climate, migration. You can't really pull one thread without affecting all the others. Understanding that interconnectedness is key.
Yeah. And it leaves you, the listener, with that really powerful, maybe slightly uncomfortable question from one of the sources. So where do we go from here? It really makes you think about your own connection to these huge global issues, doesn't it? And what the future might hold. Maybe you'll want to dig deeper into some of the specific spots or resources we touched on.
It certainly feels like a conversation that needs to keep going.